Today we'll be talking about the disintegration of the medieval monarchy and the medieval polity, the nobility, through the War of the Roses. That's the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Here on Just Feudal Things, episode 16. If you would like more medieval content in your life, you will find the links in the description to my Substack. You will also find the link below to my X account if you are on there and would like some medieval content in your feed. Additionally, if you would like to support my work, I would appreciate if you become a paid subscriber on Substack. Of course, I appreciate all the engagement, all of your comments, your feedback, sharing the show with others. But for those of you who have the generosity and the resources to support my project financially, I am, of course, a little extra grateful. You'll have the opportunity to be in the subscriber chat, which will give you a little sneak peek into podcast episodes, as well as give you the chance to potentially ask a question to a guest. Today, I have for you a very unique discussion. I'm not sure you'll find something like this anywhere else, as my guest today is I don't know that he's really all across social media. It's Taylor Kniphfer. I hope I've said that correctly. He's a historian of late medieval Britain. He's currently finishing his PhD on the Dutchy of Lancaster during the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period. More broadly, he's interested in the themes of medieval kingship, chivalry, political society, warfare, and law. He can be found at the Substack, The Musings of a Gentleman Historian, which I would recommend you also follow him there for more history in your life, and you will find the link to his Substack in the description as well. August is going to be a little bit of a two-parter, I suppose, since the next episode of the podcast is also going to feature the Wars of the Roses. With that said, let's jump right into the discussion. All right, so the War of the Roses is one of the most popular times in English history, certainly relative to current pop culture. It's obviously been given a fair amount of treatment since Shakespeare. Game of Thrones is apparently heavily based on the War of the Roses. Why is the War of the Roses so popular?
So many reasons, I think. I think largely, first of all, we have to say Shakespeare has a huge amount to play in that. Writing the 3 or 4 plays that he did in the 1590s, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and then Richard III, really brought that into prominence in the time period just a century after the wars happened, and they've really not lost their popularity since then. I think part of the reason is the interesting characters involved. You have a lot of very fascinating characters involved in the high political stakes of the time, whether that's King Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, Edward IV, Elizabeth Woodville, Warwick the Kingmaker. Another reason it may be popular today, largely because of the novels of Philippa Gregory, and I think that's interesting because of the strong women in this time period. You have very many famous names, like I said, Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville. There's also Margaret Beaufort, who, for my money, is probably the most interesting woman to have come out of the Wars of the Roses, the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. I think all of that lends itself to popular interest. I also think it lends itself because it's ultimately, if you think about it, the story of a family falling apart and deciding that they're going to mass infantry divisions against each other as they fall apart. And there's some very interesting human relevance there, along with the political circumstances and the political implications of what this family fallout does. So
it just occurred to me as you're saying this that Henry VI, he bridges the end of the 100 Years' War and the beginning of the War of the Roses. Is that right?
Yes. And in fact, you could ultimately say that one failure in war breeds into another war. I think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that when the English lose the 100 Years' War in the 1450s, it's a disaster. One modern historian, has said that it may be one of the 3 greatest foreign policy disasters in all of English/British history ever. And because of the implications of that, the English losing all of their continental inheritances, going all the way back to the 12th century, finally not just losing Normandy, which had been reconquered by Henry V, but losing Gascony, which had, of course, belonged to the family since the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, It was a complete and utter disaster. Many people think that that's what brought on Henry VI madness. He suffered maybe from a form of PTSD when he heard the news that Gascony had been lost. And so the failures of the Hundred Years' War, the failures of the English state to really make good on the achievements that had been won by first Edward III and then Henry V, taking it to the heights, arguably taking the English monarchy to the heights, the greatest heights they would ever reach in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes and making Henry V King of England and heir to the French throne and eventually, hopefully, King of France. The failure to really sustain that was, I think, one of the factors that played into the Wars of the Roses happening in the first place. Sort of foreign policy disaster of this magnitude reflected back on the English government at the time, Henry VI not being a strong king as well, and all of this just spirals together to create the context of what happens in the 1450s forward in the Wars of the Roses.
So you had mentioned something that was pretty interesting about the War of the Roses being this disintegration of medieval society. Maybe you can give me a little bit of like the brief version of that, maybe from Henry VI, the start of the War of the Roses, then to what the implications of that are.
The Wars of the Roses, in effect, because of the failures of Henry VI's kingship and the conditions that are created that eventually lead into the Wars of the Roses, breaks apart what we call the English medieval polity. It's for a lot of different reasons. One is there's a general bloodletting and a culling of the English political class. For most of the battles of the Wars of the Roses, from the major Battle of Towton in 1461 onward, the cry will often go up at the end of the battle, kill the nobles, spare the commons. So it's very much directed against the political classes themselves, trying to kill all the other opponents of whatever faction, Yorkist versus Lancastrian on the other side. There's that culling. The English government also, in some senses, because of the heightened insecurity of what happens during the Wars of the Roses, contracts. You find, interestingly enough, that once was a very large public expansive state, if you will, that had been powerful from the 13th century onwards, goes very much back into what you might have seen under King John in the early 13th century, a lot of government located in the household. As just an example of this, when things began breaking apart in the mid-1450s, Margaret of Anjou, who was the queen of Henry VI and a much stronger character than her husband, effectively takes the king, his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, and herself off to what are the centers of the Lancastrian inheritance, because, of course, the kings of England by this time period are also the Dukes of Lancaster, and bases Henry between Coventry and Kenilworth, really making him kind of a factional king and herself a factional queen rather than a national figure, you might say. And it could be argued that the response to that from the Yorkist side is to do very much the same thing of ruling like a magnate. And so instead of a king who rules for all of his subjects, which is the medieval ideal, which is the type of kingship that Edward I so magnificently leads and shows Edward III, Henry V as well. You have much more of a factional king who acts as though he's at war with his own kingdom in this time period. So the culling of the nobility, factionalization of kingship, you might say. And then there's also, very interestingly, for people like me who love administrative history, kind of an atrophy of the administrative systems, the great administrative departments of Chancery, the Exchequer, which have been around for 300 years by this point, really atrophy in this time period. They lose a lot of their momentum. The people who staff them are often people who come from much different backgrounds than they had before, and it loses cohesion, once again throwing the king back into his household, which he is using for basic necessities such as finance, as well as mobilization of manpower because of the insecurity of the times. So you go from a very powerful state that can administer law internally, that can raise huge amounts of taxation in a way that modern states would be envious of, and a kingdom, a state that can take on the greatest power in continental Europe, France, and often beat it. You go from that to what looks, as one historian says, by the end of the 15th century, very much like a failed state, and it's hard to really quibble with that in some senses. So I think those are three major points there. The culling of the nobility, contraction or factionalization of kingship, and the atrophying of the administration. And all of this together throws what we might call the medieval constitution. And I can talk more about that if you'd like. What is the medieval constitution? Because, of course, it's not written down. It's purely evolutionary. Throws that into the spanner, so to speak, throws that entire thing into the works. And ultimately, you have the accession of the last man standing, Henry Tudor, who attempts partially to build on the medieval inheritance, doesn't fully jettison it, but at the same time, the Tudors do end up ruling England in a very different way, largely because of what's happened during the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, maybe tell me a little bit what you mean about the medieval constitution.
This is a great question. Sort of, what is the medieval constitution? What is a medieval king supposed to do, right? I think we have a vague notion that there are kings, but unlike modern times where we think, well, we know what a president's supposed to do. You know, they give an inaugural address to set forward the plan. That doesn't happen in the Middle Ages. What is a king supposed to do? I think the best representation of what a king is supposed to do is on the seal, his great seal that officiates all his great acts. So there's a obverse and a reverse. On the obverse, the king is enthroned, sitting as a judge, the idea of administering justice for the kingdom. On the reverse, he is mounted on a war horse, brandishing a sword and a shield, the idea that he is going to be the warrior defender of his people. A contemporary of the Wars of the Roses, a man by the name of Sir John Fortescue, who was a lawyer and also wrote a manuscript called The Governance of England. He was trying to effectively do a constitutional analysis of what had gone wrong during the Wars of the Roses, during the 1470s when there was a lull in the fighting, to see what had happened and maybe how we could prevent this. And his declaration is that the office of a king is to judge and to fight. That's what a king is supposed to do. Now, defend England internally with laws, defend it externally with arms. And of course, a king has interests that he himself wants to pursue. If he has an interest that he wants to pursue, and he's going to need material and morale, so the idea of money and political support to do it, how does he do that? Well, he relies upon counsel. The idea is that a medieval king needs counsel to mitigate the ego that's definitely going to be there, hopefully in a man of supreme political will. He takes counsel with not just his great lords, his magnates, his barons, his great bishops, prelates, but also there's the idea of taking counsel from what's come to be called the commons in parliament. And a king's leadership of parliament by the 15th century is really key. Successful kings are great leaders of parliament. Unsuccessful kings do not relate well to parliament. He needs to take the counsel of his subjects, be amenable to that, answer their calls for redress internally, and therefore they give him the support that he needs to pursue England's and his own interests, and often those two things are allied because the king and the kingdom are one externally. It's based on an understanding of constitutional norms, we might say. It's based on understanding of custom and precedent. And the interesting thing here is, of course, this is a very powerful state, but the king has no standing army and he has no police force. So how does he make his power effective, both at home and abroad? The answer is the reliance upon the private power of the nobility. There's often been this idea that the nobility are constantly wanting to get one up on the king, that they are always seeking for a chance to constrain him, if not to dethrone him. This is not correct, for lack of a better terminology. The king is the head of the aristocracy. They have a community of interests together. And when they are threatened by anything, including demands for sort of people down the social scale, they'll close ranks if need be and defend the status quo. The nobility wants to serve the king. They themselves are very powerful individuals, but they also recognize there's only one crowned and anointed king. There's no crowned and anointed earls. And they need to serve the king because through serving him, they add luster to themselves. And they're expected to put their own private resources, arms, material, themselves in war, and as well as in politics, at his disposal, regardless of how he treats them. But a good king is going to make sure he takes counsel with his magnates in order to get the best out of them. And so that they will more willingly place these resources at his disposal. It's a community of interest. It's based on custom. It's based on precedent. It's based fundamentally, as one historian of this time period, Christine Carpenter, has said, on the king fundamentally knowing and doing his job. And if he knows and does his job, there will be no problems. Most of the magnates want to work with him, as does most of the political community, whether they be bishops, commons, or, as I've said, the magnates. If the king does not know or does not do his job, that allows a vacuum to develop. And into that vacuum will step the one or two members of the political society who are always got an eye to the main chance. They're always there, whatever generation is there. They're normally pretty ineffectual at doing so, or they're normally put upon by the crown because the rest of the magnates don't want to go with them in rebelling against the king, and because the king is strong enough to enforce his will. If the king's rule breaks down, those one or two wreckers, we might say, to the political system will emerge and can do serious damage.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think there's a common perception which maybe this emerges later. Maybe we'll get into this. But I think there's a common perception that the king is sort of this unilateral, guy who just does whatever he wants. He just says whatever he wants. But obviously, reading it, you learn that the king has this reliance on the nobility, and that the sort of the entire aristocracy as a class does all sort of work together. One of the things that I run into a lot is when talking about feudalism online is people always say like, oh yeah, they took oaths of feudalism, but they always broke them. And it's like, well, you can't really have a system based on oaths if everybody's breaking the oath, can you? Like that doesn't really make any sense. Of course, there's notable exceptions to that. There are times when somebody breaks their oath or, goes back on whatever, there are those instances, but those are very rare. In order for the system to actually work, you have to have the guys doing what they say they're going to do. The oath has to be worth something. Nobody's taking oaths that just all mean nothing. That's a very helpful thing to learn about how the aristocracy and the nobility really all work together in the period, or at least develop together over the course of the medieval period, to have a sort of real working relationship. Because that kind of leads into my sort of next thought on the War of the Roses is Henry VI being such an incapable king, maybe is fair. Why wasn't he deposed? Why wasn't he, I guess, why didn't they get rid of him?
That's the $1,000,000 question, I suppose, in many ways. The thing about Henry VI is that he's traditionally on the list of the bad medieval kings. There's four great medieval kings: Henry II, Edward I, Edward III, Henry V. I think you might be able to honorable mention to Richard the Lionheart and William the Conqueror probably as well for those six really effective kings. For the bad kings, you have John, Edward II, Richard II, and Henry VI. Henry VI is the most interesting of the bad kings because he's not a bad man. He's just a weak man, but that's not because he's a bad man. He just is not a very strong individual. He's one of those characters you run into all the time in today's life. Easygoing, go with the flow, ultimately a very nice individual. You would want to spend some time with him, maybe grab a cup of coffee with him, maybe have a beer with him. But in your heart of hearts, you don't want this man running any large organization because you know that while he's a great guy, he's going to get walked on by everybody around him who have less than savory ideas about actually how to manage stuff. Henry's that type of an individual. I think part of Henry's problem is he becomes king at the youngest age of any English monarch. He's 9 months old when his father, Henry V, the archetype of a great king in so many ways, dies. And he, more than even Edward II, Richard II, or John, never ever sees another man being king. He is king from the moment that he is himself conscious of himself and his own identity. And because of that, what happens with Henry is rather interesting. He just does not seem to have much of a royal will of his own. There are two schools of thought about Henry in modern academia, and I kind of fall between the two. One is by a historian named Bertram Wolfe, who wrote in the 1980s that Henry was actually a bad actor, that he was more along the lines of a Richard II or an Edward II, a genuinely bad actor who was either bumbling a lot or was not behaving in a way that was conducive to being a good king. That idea is largely discredited now, and much more popular is the idea developed by historian John Watts, as well as Christine Carpenter, is that Henry's really a blank slate. He's very ineffective. He's effectively an empty vessel. There's nothing there. There's no will. There's no agenda. There's nothing. And he's therefore a tool of other people, whether positively or negatively. And then there's the view that I have, which is in between those two extremes. And this is shared by historians like David Grummett, as well as Jonathan Sumption, the great historian of the 100 Years' War, is that Henry, for the most part, is very go with the flow, what we might call ineffectual. He does have things that he's passionate about, such as religion and church building, and he's very passionate about peace with France towards the end of the 100 Years' War. He is driving that peace policy. But there are very few things that he's going to get worked up about, and that hands the political initiative to others because of how empty he sort of is. In many ways, he looks like the model king. He responds to advice. He takes advice from people. He mitigates his ego. He mitigates his will based on counsel. The problem is there's not much of an ego, and there's not much of a will to mitigate in the first instance. And if a king does not have the will to drive political society, and that's a key aspect, the king ultimately, while he responds to counsel, while he must avail himself of counsel, it's his government. He makes the decisions. And if you have a guy like Henry VI, who's very indecisive and can't drive government with his will, that creates a political vacuum. And ultimately, that's why he's such an ineffectual king. He's too feeble to make any aspect of his government works. And that means that people such as, you might say, William de la Pole, the Earl and eventually Duke of Suffolk, who's in many ways his chief minister in the 1440s and 1450s. And some people would actually say the man genuinely running the show for most of that time period. That hands the political initiative to them. It also means that he can become the tool of faction, however. And that's one aspect of the Wars of the Roses, and that's one aspect you see of him. The reason he's not deposed, ultimately, is because he is still the king, and he is useful as that tool of faction. The Lancastrians and the Yorkists keep trying to get control of his person in order to effectively rule through him through the 1450s and 1460s. The other thing about Henry is that he goes mad. Famously, in 1453, he has a mental breakdown. We don't know necessarily what it was. We can't really diagnose at a distance of almost 600 years. He has some type of mental breakdown where he is catatonic and cannot really do anything and even move himself for about 15 months from 1453 to late 1454. If you're mad, as one historian said, you're kind of touched by God. So, in some sense, are you responsible for your political actions? Even as the reign is getting worse and worse, are you responsible for your political actions? I think there's that question as well. I also think, and this is a supposition, but I think it's a supposition backed up with some research, there's a large degree of loyalty to the memory of Henry V amongst the nobility, even of those who are now not part of the generation that helped Henry V conquer Normandy and win Agincourt in the 1410s and 1420s. They are supremely loyal to that man's memory, and therefore they are supremely loyal to his son. And I think for those reasons, that's why Henry VI is able to stay on his throne so long, until really the Yorkists are left with no choice but to get rid of him and acclaim a king of their own in the person of Edward IV.
I do think that Henry is, of all the bad kings mentioned, he certainly is the most sympathetic of all of them. He's, like you said, he doesn't grow up in his father's household. And I think when you look at any of these kings that grow up, because there are other examples of in the medieval period of kings that grow up really, without their father or in some sort of regency. Frederick II comes to mind. That they have a pretty tough time then establishing themselves, getting their footing, figuring things out, because in the regency you can be so manipulated, or there's sort of all these people sort of wondering what's going on, or sort of priming you to be sort of their agent. So it's a very difficult situation, I think, much more difficult than we might assume on the face. So I think he's a very sympathetic figure. And that is interesting, I guess, that the Yorks in the end have to get rid of him.
There's an interesting thing about Henry is that we do actually have knowledge of public declarations against him, which is unique. We really only have evidence from this from Edward II as well. But Henry VI, Edward II is often said, you have people spouting off of the mouth that he's not the son of Edward I. What they mean by that is that he's not his father's son. He's not a carbon copy of the old man. But that can be taken as seditious speech, and of course that's pursued as well. For Henry, you actually have people saying things along the lines of, it would have been better had he died when he was born, because he's been such an effective king, and his uncle becoming king. It would be, it's no surprise that he's losing against Charles VII in France, because Charles VII is an able king and this guy's kind of a loser. Everything along those lines there's just a ton of public pronouncements against Henry that are pursued in the law courts because they are a form of seditious speech. And there are very few stories about this, but that actually shows that popularly he is seen as a weak king by even the commonest of his subjects. There are people who are discussing that this king, for the first time, it's not that he's oppressing us, it's that he just seems to not be doing anything at all.
All right. So War of the Roses, then we get into that. Maybe tell us a little bit about how Shakespeare has shaped the public consciousness on this. Shakespeare
is probably where a lot of people with an interest in English kingship start, in some senses, because of his storytelling ability. He's not, of course, accurate. He's not a historian. He's no interest necessarily in history. He has an interest in drama and telling a good story. I do think he often gets close to the context of the time and the feeling of the time, even if the details are wrong. And I think the idea that he presents is that the Wars of the Roses is a period of political disintegration amongst the ruling class. If the detail is wrong, the essence is probably right there, that it is a period of political disintegration. He largely gives the picture of these kings at the time. So you have a pathetic Henry VI. You have a Margaret of Anjou, who is really quite a nefarious, demonic kind of character, and that's really not how the actual Margaret was at all. But that's who Shakespeare kind of makes as a central leading antagonist of the entire play structure, is Margaret driving the war forward, driving the orcs into opposition. He treats people like Warwick the Kingmaker, relatively sympathetically, which is why I think there's a large degree of sympathy for Warwick as a king. But of course, Shakespeare's ultimate popular relevance here is his portrayal of Richard III, which everyone who is a fan of Richard III, they hate this play because it makes him into one of the most evil people to have ever walked on a stage or ever walked across the screen. Richard III is a diabolical villain. He's also quite a clever villain. He's one who speaks to the audience, and a man who's sort of seemingly from very early on is plotting to make himself king, wants to become a very powerful figure at court, and uses political manipulation to do that. And it also seems to be that he's one of the people that drives the bloodletting in the plays. So Shakespeare's relevance is because of the essence of the story he's telling of political disintegration. It's also because of the way that he writes up the characters of this time period. Now, we do have to be cautious about this because, of course, Shakespeare's writing in the time of the Tudor dynasty, and the end of the Wars of the Roses, as he chronicles it in The Tragedy of Richard III, is that everything is being prepared for the accession of Henry Tudor, who is going to, of course, become Henry VII, and his granddaughter Elizabeth I is currently sitting on the throne. So Shakespeare is very much presenting the Tudors as a salvation for the English political community. And of course, due to the popularity of those first four plays, George Lucas doesn't invent the prequel, Shakespeare does. He goes back and writes Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V, and he says the entire period from 1399 to 1485 is effectively a period of original sin because of Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II. That's where the Wars of the Roses starts for Shakespeare. Now, historians say that's not accurate. We wouldn't start the Wars of the Roses much beyond the 1450s, though there's political troubles starting from the 1440s and 1430s. But that's Shakespeare's legacy. And if you look on some textbooks of the period, even up until the 20th century, 1399 to 1485 are taken as the brackets for the 15th century. I think that's Shakespeare's influence right there. You know, seeing the entire period, bar the brief successes of Henry V, as a grand period of political insecurity and a grand period of political conspiracy and rebellion and the destruction of the ruling house and medieval government itself.
So my real beef with Shakespeare is that he wrote a play about Richard II, Richard III, and John, but not Richard the Lionheart. Maybe the way that he treated Richard III, maybe it's better that he didn't, I guess.
I think the problem with doing Richard I might have been the crusading aspect, given how rampantly Protestant England was quickly becoming by the end of the 16th century. I'm not certain that a play that would have had to have been focused on the crusade would have been very popular. It's another historian said, why didn't you write a play about William the Conqueror? Well, an invasion of England sanctioned by the Pope in the reign of either Elizabeth I or James I is probably not something that's going to win you much popularity points with the government and might get your theater closed down.
Yeah, that makes sense. I suppose you don't want people thinking about that stuff at the time. All right, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about, because you said something that was interesting about how this is like the disintegration of medieval society, or let's say the disintegration of the medieval constitution. Did I get that right?
I think that's fair. I think it's very fair.
So then moving into the Tudors, I'm a little familiar with Henry VIII. I read a biography on him a couple of years ago. And you had mentioned that a weak king is set up for this factionalism. And what occurred to me when you said that was how much Henry VIII's reign seems governed by these factions. You have whatever the Woodvilles, or, he marries somebody else and their family comes in, or then you have whatever his couple guys, or it's Wolsey, or I forget all their various names, but it seems very factional, and all of these people sort of jockeying with each other and trying to pull a political stunt on one another, to get this wife beheaded to get her family out of here, or get this guy beheaded to get his faction out of here, or whatever is the thing. Is that kind of what you mean by sort of this disintegration, the weaker monarchy, or I guess how do we look at that then leading into the Tudors?
The central problem, I think, for the Tudors, or at least Henry VII's problem, is that the nobility has been so weakened by the Wars of the Roses. So many of them have been killed that they're not necessarily around in great numbers to perform the ideal role of service advisor, counselor to the monarch anymore. But there's also the fact that Henry VII at least comes in with zero political experience. Even though he's technically the Earl of Richmond, he has never been able to enjoy his estates in peace because of the Wars of the Roses. He's either been sort of a house guest, we might say in inverted commas, of Yorkist partisans, or he's been in exile in Brittany. And because of his lack of political experience, he relies on a cadre of men who have been with him in exile or who know his mother. Margaret Beaufort's really actually very heavily involved in staffing the Tudor regime because of her contacts. And it's these group who are called his new men. Stephen Gunn, who's a historian at Oxford, wrote a book about this just shy of a decade ago. It's actually a book really looking at the connections these new men bring. And kings have always had new men going all the way back to the Norman period. There were condemnations of even a king like Henry I for his new men in the early 12th century. This time it's different. These new men really do seem to plant themselves both at court and the English localities. There's a much bigger connection now between the court and the localities, giving the king an ideal of control over the localities that he didn't necessarily have before, of direct control, rather than going through the nobility and the gentry who were there on site. And that does make rule different because these are ultimately new men who can create factions amongst themselves. The idea of factions for Henry VIII's reign, that is actually a historical interpretation of his reign, that, there's the factions against factions, and what's going on here. Is Henry VIII really in control? Henry VIII, in my view, is a very clever Machiavellian type of politician. He gets ministers to take the blame for unpopular decisions, and he likes to manage with chaos around him. That's how he manages as a king. He likes to have chaos that he can cordon off and control, and that's why he encourages the factions. Ultimately, you might think that the factions show up because that's just the reality of serving a king like Henry VIII, who is in very many ways a tyrant. And if you serve a tyrant, maybe it does go into this mob-esque factional struggle for his ear. But it's Henry who all the time remains the driving controller of government policy in the Tudor regime, you might say. So the factions are definitely there. I do think that the court politics, the court becoming a much more important place in the Tudor regime, does feed into that factionalism as well. And that's ultimately something you did not have in the medieval constitution. Henry VII in particular decides that he's going to make a new area of his apartments, effectively the privy chamber, which he will go and hide in and govern in secret largely from. So you kind of have a secret government of the kingdom versus the public open rule and court of earlier kings like an Edward III or even an Edward IV in the Yorkist period. You really have the idea now of a spider in his web with Henry VII. And while Henry VIII, who sees himself in many ways as the heir of Edward IV is his maternal grandfather, and they look very similar and behave very similarly. Nevertheless, there's also the continuation of factions, and there's the continuation of the politicization of the court under Henry VIII that really makes difficulties for the time period.
One of the things that maybe contributes to the popularity here of the War of the Roses, as you're kind of saying, is this increase in the factionalism and maybe also the increase in the record keeping of the time, which sort of allows for a lot more fleshed out personalities, of our understanding of these personalities. And then, of course, they're sort of scheming and infighting and all of this stuff that sort of creates a lot of the drama, right? That maybe doesn't exist, at least in any sort of way, like you're saying with these previous kings. It doesn't exist, at least in any sort of way that we can recollect from the record, if you will, of sort of these different scheming people and, the backstabbing and the drama and all that stuff, maybe from a time of whatever, Edward I or something. And so it creates this sort of very personal story, I guess, of a lot of these characters as they're scheming to fight each other, take each other out, jockey for power, if you will. Is that kind of fair?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very fair. There have been examples of this type of infighting before at royal courts, but it's in the reigns of ineffective kings. I think that's something interesting to consider. We have elements of this from the reign of Richard II in England in the late 14th century, and no one rates Richard II's management style very highly, nor should they. So I think it's indicative of medieval politics, open, plain speaking. The idea of, as for example, during Edward I's reign, where you have this row between him and the Earl of Norfolk, where they literally start shouting at each other at a parliament. that's actually an element of strong kingship, because Edward can shout with one of his noblemen. They can disagree, and that doesn't actually end up in anyone losing their head. It shows that the king understands that people want to make their opinions heard, and he can fight back or he can listen, and they know what plain speaking is versus actual political dissent. For the Tudors, it seems they conflate political dissent and plain speaking a lot of the time. So no one wants to say anything bad about the king because, well, Henry VIII introduces treason by word. So you do have elements of factionalism before, but at the same time, reigns of ineffective kings where that really happens, not effective kings. They can maintain openness and political dialogue. For me, one of the interesting things about the time period is the people who are trying to keep the show on the road. That's ultimately the people I find very interesting, the people out to the side rather than sometimes the major political figures trying to stabilize political society. People like, for example, Cardinal John Kemp, who's one of the last great Lancastrian statesmen in the 1450s, really trying to hold political society together. I think there are a few people like that in the reign of Edward IV as well. It's a time where really you're trying to find some type of modus operandi, some type of middle ground. The problem is, because of this disintegration, as we've discussed, of political society, there's less and less availability to find that middle ground politically, to coalesce some type of regime under the leadership, nominally, if nothing else, of a king like Henry VI or any type of individual. Really, this period of bloodletting allows anyone with blunt force and a blood claim to the throne to be able to make themselves heard and to be able to impose themselves politically.
So it seems like generally the medieval period, then this idea of monarchy as sort of a collaboration between the nobility, if you will. I'm sort of making things up as I go here, but that's how it sort of strikes me, as a collaboration between the nobility. Versus, as we're getting into this later period of this factionalism, and sort of the nobility seems to be much more in competition with one another, or fighting with one another, I suppose, for power. And so you're saying that's sort of like a disintegration. That's sort of much more of a sign of weakness. So why do you think it is then that the medieval period generally is like, what strikes me is that this characterization of weakness and factionalism and sort of the tyrant, if you will, is sort of how the entire medieval period gets colored, as opposed to being much more open, having these robust kings and this collaboration amongst the nobilities. Like, why do you think that this has, it seems like it's kind of colored the entire medieval period, if you will? And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, I guess.
Sort of the idea of why the medieval period is often, or why medieval is often used as a pejorative, why we see this as a very dark and politically ineffective time. I think this is not going to make me win any popularity contest, but I think it has a lot to do with the influence of American culture. American culture doesn't really see kings as anything except potential tyrants. If you talk to most Americans, kings are always potential tyrants. They can never rule over a free people, so to speak. And they're often seen as just, people take the example of Henry VIII and run with it and say all kings are like Henry VIII. They're, tyrannizing their subjects, or they're cutting their wives' heads off, when we know that Henry VIII is a very unique individual. I think that has a large degree to do with it. I think that's why so many people go to the Middle Ages and see the Middle Ages as a time where everything is dark and that rule is not really open, because it's ruled by a single individual. Now, monarchy is never really ruled by a single individual, nor is a king really as absolute as a totalitarian dictator of the 20th century, which is in many ways far more dark regimes in the 20th century than anything you find in the Middle Ages. But it's just the idea that if there is a lack of freedom, everything must be dark. Well, what type of freedom are you talking about here? It's going back to the conversation you had with Dr. Levy-Roach about feudalism. Is feudalism just slavery? Well, no, there's a large degree of complexity in feudalism, of serfdom versus free peasants, and having the land descend through the families. What do you owe your lord? What does your lord owe you? Much more obligation and reciprocal obligation, you might say. But there is this notion that if it's not freedom, re-freedom, so to speak, or freedom writ large, then it must be a dark period. And I think that's largely an influence of Americanism on the study of the past, whereas Middle Age is a very different time period in that. I also think there is a lot of hostility to the Middle Ages because of the power of the Catholic Church. And during the time period, and seeing that as largely an evil organization, or at least an organization that's spouting untruths and is getting people to pay their way into heaven. So those two things, the influence of American culture because of those things, I think is one reason why we often see the Middle Ages as a very dark and pejorative period. But of course, there's no period in human history that's ever fully dark. And you have to look at the complexities of the time period. There were medieval individuals who were dark and very nefarious individuals. There were also those who did great things and left a lasting legacy, whether that be in politics, whether that be in art, whether that be in music. And it's important to understand that every period in human history has these complexities in them. The Middle Ages is not totally devoid of light, nor is the Enlightenment of the 18th century very illuminating, as far as I'm concerned. So there's always these complexities.
So we might be going a little off the rails here, and it's maybe my job as the host to bring it back in. But I will add, as an American, I have been sort of contemplating, now that I've been very much studying the medieval period, that the American concept of sovereignty, Americans don't seem to understand sovereignty very well, or what it is, or what it should do, or any of this sort of, what exactly how government should work. There's of course always this idea of, well, if you get a bad king, look at how screwed you are. But there's never the concept of, well, if you get a good king, imagine how good things could be.
Exactly.
So,
hereditary monarchy. Yeah, hereditary monarchy is the only system of monarchy that works. It has its Achilles heel in the character of the next generation. Sometimes you're going to get Henry VI, but sometimes you'll get Charlemagne. But that's ultimately any political system, I think, is that sometimes you get a great leader and sometimes you don't get such a great leader. What matters is, if you don't necessarily have a great leader, do you have a system that can survive a lackluster leader? And what it was proved to be, unfortunately for England during the Wars of the Roses, is that while they had a very developed governmental system, the key issue is if the character of the king is not able to match that governmental system, the whole thing falls into disarray because the king is still the linchpin of political society. I don't think there's ever a way to, in a monarchical system, ever to have a system that doesn't rely to some degree on the character of the king and him being able to use his character and use his will to make political society work.
Yeah, and one of the real, I suppose, frustrations about reading about this history for me is that when you have a bad king, you just look at the bad king and be like, hey, this guy's terrible. You get rid of him, you start over. But you can't really do that in a system that we have right now, where when the president changes, even though so many things stay the same, and there may be things that people want to change, but that doesn't change with the president. And so you're kind of, it's a little bit of a strange spot, I suppose, that we're in right now, or just maybe that we're in generally without that sort of system. So, I think that all I'm saying is that there are benefits to it that I can see. The transparency aspect being a big one, where hey, this is a bad king. You should get rid of the bad king. You get a new king. Mm-hmm. He makes the decisions. Hey, they're good or bad. The king's good or bad. But I certainly I find things a little confusing when you don't know who's making the decisions. So
I think we do need to be cautious, though, because they would suffer a bad king for a long time before they would try to get rid of him. The deposition would not become an option until after largely 20 years of misrule. And because the fundamental precept is loyalty. This is the king. He's appointed by God. This is the line of descent. He's the king we have to work with. We've got to try to make this work for as long as possible. Deposition, at least from the time period of Edward II forward, was the nuclear option. When they went for it, they recognized what was going to happen next, and hopefully the new king would be much better and would be able to contain any fallout. Sometimes that was the case, sometimes not necessarily. And of course, even when they were getting rid of the king, they had to make the case that the next king coming along, whoever that might be, was the rightful heir some way, somehow. This was easy for Edward II because, of course, what they did was they just moved Edward III's accession up, you might say. Just a premature accession of a 14-year-old boy who's in the line for it anyway and is the rightful heir. What happens with Richard II and Henry VI is, are Henry IV and Edward IV the actual rightful inheritors of the throne? Henry VI has a son, for example, while Richard II didn't, but Henry VI has a son, so what's going on there? Can't we just get rid of Henry VI and make his son the king? Well, no, according to the Orcus, because they've got the superior claim to the throne. all these complexities mean that there's never really a desire to get rid of the king unless they absolutely have to. I think they would have probably continued on with Henry VI if at all possible. It's just the unfortunate fact that the Yorkist family also had a claim to the throne, which they argued was superior through their descent from Edward III. And at this point, they had lost custody of Henry, and they needed a king of their own, so they elevated Edward IV.
Henry VI, I find him to be just he's a very interesting guy, and his whole thing is very interesting. So, but when we get to the end of the War of the Roses, you end up with Richard III, and then Thomas Stanley. Actually, first of all, what's the deal with Thomas Stanley? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? What's his deal?
Thomas Stanley is one of the most fascinating individuals to come out of the Wars of the Roses. He's a political trimmer. He's a master political trimmer. He makes sure some way, somehow, he's always on the winning side. I don't necessarily know that bespeaks a lack of principle. I think that just shows his intense pragmatism as a man who has come through the fire of all of this, a man who wants to maintain his position in local society in northwestern England and Lancashire as one of the great lords of the time. He's just the great political trimmer of the time period, always making sure he comes through and his family comes through on the winning side. Waiting until the right moment to declare yourself for whoever it may be. I think of that as political skills. And, he ends up becoming Earl of Derby and living to a ripe old age in his 70s, which is a pretty good legacy for a medieval nobleman.
Am I misremembering? Didn't his son get dispossessed or something happened to his son?
His brother,
Henry VII?
Sir William Stanley. So Sir William Stanley is also a fascinating character. And they kind of operate a dual power structure in the northwest of England and Lancashire and Cheshire, where they have most of their lands, is actually Sir William, not Thomas Lord Stanley, who makes the decisive intervention at Bosworth, comes in to lead the Stanley troops to effectively decide to kill Richard III, or to isolate him and kill him, because the Stanley family will benefit because Thomas Stanley is the husband of Margaret of Anjou, is her fourth husband, and therefore he's the stepfather to the now Henry VII. So there's the idea that they'll benefit from that. Ultimately, Sir William Stanley doesn't feel that he does benefit greatly from that. And there are whispers that he begins talking with Yorkist pretenders who are becoming very much in vogue in the 1490s. And there's an investigation of him. By this point, he's the chamberlain of the royal household, so he's in charge of the apartments of the king. And they apparently find a Yorkist livery collar of the White Rose in his possession. And there's this idea that maybe this has gone beyond mere words. Maybe he really is plotting to get rid of Henry VII, and so he is convicted and he is executed. It's a symbol of, I think, the political insecurity of the times. First of all, that Stanley begins thinking that maybe I had a better bet a decade ago with the Yorkists than I thought I had, but also that Henry VII treats this immediately as a treasonable offense that we have to cut this guy's head off all automatically. It just shows how, even with the Wars of the Roses technically being over by Henry VII's reign, there's still the political insecurity that's a legacy of them.
Well, and there's a couple other things that happen with supposedly the sons of Edward IV, right? Was it like
yes.
Warburton or
So
forget their names.
Pretender is Lambert Simnel, who's not one of the Edward's sons. He's supposed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, who's the son of the middle brother between Edward IV and Richard III. That would be George, Duke of Clarence, who, for my money, is a very fascinating figure. He's also a very hard figure to like, which is, I think, why very few people write biographies of Clarence. But Lambert Simnel in 1486-87, leading up to the Battle of Stoke, which is technically, we all want to look at Bosworth because it's a king dying. We say that's the decisive battle. Really, it's Stoke in 1487, 2 years later, with the idea of putting Lambert Simnel, who's supposed to be claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, on the throne. He's not Edward, Earl of Warwick. The actual Edward, Earl of Warwick is in the Tower, and Henry VII parades him in public, and then he goes off to Stoke and defeats this army that's being led on Lambert Simnel's behalf. The more serious pretender is Perkin Warbeck, and Warbeck claims to be Richard, Duke of York, the second son of Edward IV. There's a lot of people today who might like to actually say that his claim was true, that maybe he was Richard, Duke of York. I, for one, don't buy that, but you can't deny that there's a lot of money and effort from continental Europe, from rulers like Margaret, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, who is the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. So you might say she has a stake in believing that this man is her nephew. But also, I believe, and I'm not sure how she relates to Maximilian Habsburg off the top of my head, but interest from him. James IV of Scotland, when Perkin Warbeck goes to Scotland, gives him his cousin to marry in 1496. So there does seem to be this way of view of saying that Warbeck either really impresses people, maybe some people are taken in by his story, or if they're not, such as the view that Henry VII is held in by most continental rulers, that they're able to gamble on Warbeck actually being able to overthrow him, regardless of his legitimacy. Which just goes to show how much the political system is disintegration, because if now we're saying that, well, we're not even sure about the legitimacy of this guy, but we'll support him and maybe give him a go to destabilize England, that really does show how everything has gone to hell in a handcart, for lack of a better term.
Editor Michael here, and a quick note, we will be diving a lot further into the princes in the tower with a very special guest in the next episode, so if you would like to hear more about that, you will not want to miss it. So all of this political disintegration in England, how does that affect wider late medieval Europe? Is it because how, Anglo England has influenced, the world in centuries after that? Or did continental Europe also experience some similar changes with their monarchies or whatever? How did that affect the other, if it did at all?
They did indeed. In fact, there's actually been a lot of work done on this in a book called The Making of Politics, 1300 to 1500, if the listeners are interested. It's by John Watts, a historian I mentioned earlier. And effectively, he recounts that from period of 1450 to 1480 in Europe, not just in England, but Europe-wide, there's a series of civil wars everywhere. It's almost like kingly authority is under attack in many different areas. There's multiple civil wars against Charles VII and then against Louis IX. In France, there is civil war, and also between family members as well. The same thing is going on in the Wars of the Roses in Spain, where you have Henry IV of Castile against his sister, the future Isabella, who, of course, will marry Ferdinand and unite Spain. There's problems in Scotland at this time period. James III, who is my candidate for the most unfairly maligned medieval monarch. I think James has been given a pretty hard ride by historians. He's king for 28 years, from 1460 to 1488, and there's, to a large degree, a crisis of kingship in Scotland with family members as well. So it's almost like dynastic politics in Europe more widely in this time period goes through a bit of a disintegration, not just England. England is the most famous because, Shakespeare didn't write plays about the civil wars in France or Spain or Scotland. He wrote them about England. But it's happening in other places, and I might have left out something there. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on any of these other countries, and particularly the farther east you get in Europe, my knowledge just goes completely away. If I remember correctly, however, there are also similar issues within the Holy Roman Empire in the late 15th century at the time period. Not that the Holy Roman Empire is ever very much of a stable entity anyway.
And I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna play some jazz here and ask you a question that maybe relates, because it's kind of my unscholarly, amateur enthusiast opinion that a big part of the disintegration of, let's say, the nobility or monarchy, and the sort of system generally, is also due in part to the proliferation of firearms and the hiring of mercenaries, because prior to that, the nobility obviously could be sort of relied upon to be, they had a monopoly on military violence, essentially. Whereas once you start getting into gunpowder and mercenaries, you can obviously just hand a gun to a guy and he can shoot some guy who's trained for 20 years to be a knight or whatever. And so you sort of end up with the cart being overturned a little bit of the effectiveness of the nobility to sort of exercise their primary role, which in my opinion is where they primarily got a lot of their power from. Is that sort of a fair characterization of things happening at this time, do you think?
I think there's something in that. I don't know if I'd say fully that there's something in that, but I think there is something there. Definitely the proliferation of mercenaries in the time period. Well, of course, that happened earlier in the Middle Ages as well with John and other kings like that. There's warnings against that. If you look at Machiavelli and some of his political writings, he always is very much down on mercenaries because they will only ever be loyal to the person paying them. They're never going to be loyal to the state. The idea that guns is a great leveler is something that is very interesting, and that happens from the 14th century forward. You have Edward III, the great king of chivalry, employing guns for the first time on a medieval battlefield in 1346 at Cressy, along with the longbowmen, and our longbowmen and guns, not the levelers of knights, you might say. But still, even with that technology there, the nobility of medieval Europe is able to continue its military role into the late Middle Ages, and I would say, continue its military role very, very late on. And for example, if you look at, and I'm once again not an expert, but if you look at late Ancien Regime France, the army is one of the places dominated by the nobility. What might happen is an administrative evolution. Something I'm looking at is the 16th century is when the state is trying to tighten its grip on everything, and not just political society, but also the church. Look what happens in England under the reign of Henry VIII. For that, you need a new type of administrator. And that's these individuals who really come from the new men that we were talking about earlier, a figure like Thomas Cromwell in England, or a Cardinal Richelieu later in France in the 17th century. These are individuals who are not from the nobility. They are not using the noble precepts of service and loyalty to the sovereign that was the medieval ideal, and they are increasingly the dominant political actors. I don't think that there's any slippage militarily. Necessarily, I think the nobility still remain pretty heavily involved militarily, maybe not always due to the proliferation of guns and other things like that. What happens is that their political power slips. They maintain their standing as the military elite, but some of their political status, their political elite power goes, and the kings rely more and more on these new counselors in the building of this new administrative state in the 16th century.
Yeah, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about that, the transition to this administrator. Does that happen with Henry VII then?
I think there's elements that are happening already before Henry VII, because in many ways Henry VII is pursuing the same political policies that his father-in-law, Edward IV, was pursuing before him. But I do genuinely think there is a change with the Tudor dynasty in England. I think the Tudors rule with what historians refer to as a royal party. It's kind of like the Soviet system where you have an informal party structure that backs up the political structure. I think that's very much the case for the Tudors, that they have these new men who effectively form a party structure. And from there, all the factions come that we discussed earlier. These individuals really are concerned with giving the king what he wants, not necessarily standing up to the king and telling him what he should want, which was the case of medieval counselors. A good example of this is an apocryphal, it didn't actually happen, conversation between Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell in the reign of Henry VIII, where Thomas More is standing very much for that old medieval notion of, yes, we want the king's rule to be effective, but we also have to mitigate his worst impulses at times. And Cromwell saying effectively that the job of a counselor is to achieve his king's aims, first and foremost, rather than actually worrying about what those aims necessarily are at times. I think you do have more of a dependence of these new counselors on the will of the king, and you have the desire of the king not to lead political society, to control it. And I do think there's a difference there. I think in England, what I'm arguing in my dissertation is, a macro point I'm arguing in my dissertation is that the period involving the Wars of the Roses from 1460 through the Wars of the Roses all the way to 1540 in the reign of Henry VIII is a period of heightened political insecurity, where the monarchy wants to control more and more of the goings on of the kingdom, so the Wars of the Roses will never happen again, in effect. And I think that does breed the context for a new group of counselors who come to the fore, who are also not, as many counselors have been before, they're not clerics. That's another great thing. These are laymen. These are lawyers. These are people who have come through lay society and therefore don't necessarily have the wish to be the conscience of the king, as many of the bishops did in the earlier medieval period, or many of the clerks did in the earlier medieval period. So you do have a change here. And it's a change based on giving the king what he wants and ensuring kingly rule or kingly control, at least, on a wider scale, rather than just kingly leadership of the polity as you might have had in the Middle Ages. This is not to say that kings like Edward I were not autocratic and did not exercise control, but they led rather than sought to necessarily control. Control came with leadership. I often think Henry VIII really wants to control things rather than necessarily lead it.
And so is this rise of the administrator, if you will, is this sort of setting the table for the nation state, which sort of comes later?
I think there is a way that you can say that. I've actually referred to it as the second administrative shifts, and that's how I've begun to think about it. Because there's a first one that's in the 12th century with the rise of the clerks due to the influence of the papacy, the papal government, and the populating of royal government by more and more of these clerks, these clerical figures in the 12th century. I think the 16th century does witness the evolution of the lay administrator. Uh, I think the thing about the nation state is that there's many ways to debate that. I, for one, definitely believe there's kind of a national consciousness in England from the late 13th century forward. There were people, however, who will say that you can't have a state or you can't have a nation state in a feudal society, whatever we mean necessarily by feudal. I understand that argument. There are even people who say that you can't really have a nation state until you have the entirety of the people as the state. So some people like Benedict Anderson, who's another historian, would say that it's the French Revolution that sees the birth of the nation state. I think that's going too far in the other direction. I think you can have a perfectly respectable state, even if it's a king in a feudal society ruling over that state. So I don't necessarily know this leads to this might lead to the birth of what we might call the modern nation state. But I definitely think that nation states have been around before the 16th century. Maybe this is just the more modern flavor we have of it, though. As we get further along in human history, it's safe to say the Tudors don't look very modern anymore. So,
Yeah, this is all very interesting because one of the things that like getting into this podcast, for example, has done for me is I've gotten to speak to these more experts in the medieval Eastern Romans, and how their society is much more, well, obviously a legacy of the ancient Romans, which was much more bureaucratic and administrative, and kind of you can see it. I mean, Alexios and the Crusaders is a great example of seeing these two societies interact with each other in real time. And, now we're talking about the War of the Roses, and it seems almost like these medieval societies are sort of transitioning more into this administrative society, kind of like the ancient Romans or Eastern Romans. Does that seem, I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
one thing I've begun to think about really for medieval kings, we might say, is that they have to balance the competition between their administrators, their counselors, and the nobility. And a good king is able to really balance the needs of those two sections under his rule. Sometimes the administrators are going to say, sire, that nobleman really should pay more from the local land that he has from you. And the king will say, no, it's fine. He's doing just right now. I don't need to worry about that. So managing those two types of individuals and coalescing the entirety of the political nation together under his leadership is the goal of a medieval king. And for a more 16th century, early modern monarch, that does really seem to be using the administrators to tighten that control. And so because of that, I do think sometimes the nobility come out as losers, and in this whole time period of not actually being as prominent as they were before. So
there are people online. There's a big movement online to capital letters return with a V, and I'm not a returner with a V, but I do think it is worth looking at history to understand trade-offs. I think that there certainly are, like I mentioned with the transparency of the monarch. I think that it's worthy to understand that, okay, you can not have a monarch, but you have to understand what you're losing with transparency in that trade-off. So there obviously still exists monarchs today. Is there like a role for the monarch in the modern nation state, or like how, it almost seems a little bit like a contradiction now with the way that the state has evolved and the way that monarchy has maybe atrophied. Is that going away? There's obviously a lot of people who say we have to go back to that. I don't know what the solution for all of that is. Do you have any thoughts on how monarchy now integrates with the modern nation state?
I think it would be quite hard to go all the way back due to the internet, for example, just one thing there. The idea that anyone can express a political opinion at any time is a very different world than would have prevailed in the Middle Ages. I do think there is a role for monarchs today. It just depends on what type of monarchy do you want to have. Do you want a constitutional monarchy? If so, I think there's definitely a role for a monarch, not just simply being a figurehead, because I'm not of the opinion that you should keep a monarch around just because they provide a great figurehead. I think monarchs should and could do more than that. So in a constitutional monarchy, you might say that they can provide the role of a political referee, a political umpire. They can bring people together in terms of national parties or democratic elections. And if you look at the British monarchy before the 1950s, they were doing something very similar to that, of really trying to be a broker between political parties. I definitely think there's a role for that type of an individual today. I think you could still have an executive monarch, if you want to say. You could still have what Lafayette said about the French Constitution he tried to help make at the end of the 18th century, which was the American Constitution, but with a hereditary executive. I think you could have something similar in many European countries. The issue would be is allowing the monarch enough of a free hand, trusting the monarch enough to be able to rule on behalf of his subjects, maybe saying that certain things wouldn't go fully to him, but he would have a veto over certain actions, and that other actions would be entirely within his purview. It would just depend on how much you could get political society to want to cooperate with a reimposition of monarchical rule. Some people in this day and age, and I'm not a political scientist whatsoever, some people in this day and age claim that democracy is going through a bit of a crisis and we need to return to older models of rule while still keeping the essence of what makes democracy good. There might be a way to do that, but it would involve a lot of constitutional wrangling. Hopefully it wouldn't be as bloody as the constitutional wrangling that led to the Wars of the Roses, however, which was a similar sort of question. How do we figure out how to keep the political show on the road when we have a lackluster leader and we have people seeking their own advantage? And that political problem, I don't think, ever goes away. And there are times like the Wars of the Roses where it is definitely more pronounced and it can lead to war and civil strife. Hopefully we have systems in place nowadays that would mitigate that, but you never know. Look at other countries in the rest of the world. I think modern politics and modern history should show us how lucky many of us are to live in stable countries, that even if they don't look so stable necessarily, they're definitely stable by comparison with the rest of the world, or by some of our medieval ancestors, at least in terms of the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses is not how medieval society always was. I think the Wars of the Roses has given medieval society a bad name because people look at medieval society through Shakespeare, through Game of Thrones, which, as we said, was, the Wars of the Roses is based on Game of Thrones. That's not how medieval society always was. There were capable kings who were able to unite the political nation while also giving space for their subjects to make criticisms and ask for redress. Edward I, Edward III, and Henry V were past masters at this, certainly. There, however, were times where a crunch was reached. Normally, that crunch would just be that you, after Edward II, you would just get rid of the ineffectual king. What happened in the Wars of the Roses was a political disintegration that was also matched by competing factions that both had claims to the throne, and that's why you had a civil war. So a constitutional problem eventually became a civil war that resulted in a constitutional reset. And I think there are parallels for many other periods in history as well.
You had mentioned that earlier medieval monarchs achieved control through leadership, and these later, let's say the Tudors, they really just sought to control things. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that, maybe give an example of each, or, kind of explain that a little bit.
Sure. So Edward III was possibly the most powerful medieval ruler that England ever had. That was partly due to the context. He had the major war that he was fighting, and so a war always heightens the political leadership of a king, or any individual for that matter. At the same time, Edward, and I hope to argue this in future publication, Edward really seems to have understood that he would be supremely powerful if he worked in partnership and cooperation with not just the nobility, but with all of political society, and that included what had now developed to be the commons and parliament, the knights and burgesses of the shires, that if he worked in cooperation with them and if he gave them redress, he would be very powerful in terms of control, because he was leading the political community. He was leading it, he was shaping it, and people would serve as lions under his throne as long as he offered that type of strong leadership. And in many ways, he is the one English king who's able to really make his prerogative function almost with no challenge. There's barely a whisper of challenge ever against Edward after certain stumbling blocks here and there. The middle period of his reign, he effectively can do very much what he wants to do because political society trusts him. As an example, in 1359, he launches what's going to prove to be his last campaign of the Hundred Years' War, at least his phase of the Hundred Years' War, the Edwardian phase. He does it with no approval in Parliament. That had gotten his father, Edward II, and his grandfather, Edward I, in serious trouble during their reigns. Barely a murmur of discontent. It just shows how united the polity was behind him. Edward III could say things along the lines of, "My subjects have promised to support me with their bodies and with their riches in support of my rights." And he was not bluffing when he said stuff like that. He genuinely seems to have known that that was the case because of the leadership he offered, the political redress that he offered, the ability to compromise, to know when to employ his prerogative and when to offer a timely concession that didn't threaten his prerogative and whatsoever. And so he could offer it, as opposed to monarchs before him who thought that any time they offered a concession, they were threatening their prerogative. It involves a high degree of political skill, though, and you're not always going to have that type of a king who is politically savvy as well as politically principled, which I think Edward III was. He operated at the nexus of politics and principles in a way that someone like his grandfather, Edward I, often felt that any time he compromised a principle of the crown's rights, he was compromising his political power. Edward III showed that wasn't necessarily always the case. So that's an example of a king leading the polity, shaping the polity, as opposed to, we might say, Henry VII. Henry VII has gotten a better rep from history recently, but I still see particularly the last 9 years of his reign as an attempt to achieve control and absolute mastery over the state, using financial controls, for example, to basically put huge financial penalties over the heads of his nobility. That way that if they ever threatened to step out of line, he would call those in, effectively similar to what John had been doing in the early Middle Ages. And John, again, is another example of a king who really seeks control rather than offers leadership. So Henry VII is doing that, trying to control rather than offering leadership through bonds, financial obligations, letting his counselors like Richard Enscombe and Edmund Dudley really run the show, and effectively sort of shutting wider government down and just trying to control the situation so that Henry can die in relative peace, because he's very ill by this point, and allow the peaceful accession of his son, the future Henry VIII. It's a very different model of monarchy because it relies primarily on the idea of controlling the apparatus of the state rather than uniting it and leading it in pursuit of a wider cause, whether that be glory and war in France, but also protecting England by waging war in France and taking the war into the French countryside itself, or administering the law, things of that nature. It's really about controlling the state to ensure your dynasty succeeds. And I do think that the Wars of the Roses breaks the model a little bit there. It allows more for this notion that we have to control because we don't want these wars to happen again. Some Tudor monarchs are able to get away from that, it has to be said. I think Elizabeth I is a good example of someone who really tries to lead rather than necessarily always control. But I don't think really any of the future monarchs of England escape that. Elizabeth, for all of her glory as a queen, and undoubtedly she was the greatest queen England ever had, did kill more of her people than any other monarch, including her father. So, I mean, you see a very different monarchy, I would argue, after the Wars of the Roses than you saw before. I personally think you see a monarchy that's much less effective because how much more it wants to control things. That's a revision. Used to be it thought that the Tudors were much better monarchs than the medieval period because they did control things. I think that might be 20th century historians really thinking that the controlling power of the state is a good thing a little bit too much.
Yeah, it does seem that maybe the urge for overmuch control does sort of come from a little bit of this insecurity.
Mm-hmm. I think that actually ends up culminating in the civil wars of England in the 17th century. That's maybe to go too far, and we don't have to go too farther, but I do think there is a link there between the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century and the English civil wars, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in the 17th. The setup of a more controlling monarchy to make sure the Wars of the Roses didn't happen again. Well, they ended up happening again, and this time they were much worse because they combined the Wars of the Roses with the Anglo-Scottish Wars to make a huge conflagration. And ultimately, I do think it was because of heightened political insecurity leading to the idea of control, leading to the notion of a monarch not knowing when to let off enough political steam so the whole thing didn't blow up in his face.
A real quick note before we wrap up: if you've enjoyed the show, any comment or review that you leave on the platform helps the platform decide to show the show to some new people. So if you don't mind doing that, And don't forget to check the description for all of the associated links if you would like additional medieval content in your life. So, all right, I'll go ahead and leave you with the last word here. If there's anything else that you would like to add about the War of the Roses, anything you'd like to say, anything you think people should know about it, anything that you think they should study or care about, I'll just leave the floor open and you can say whatever you like.
One thing that I think is very fascinating, and maybe we could touch on it another time sometime, is the battles of the period. I think the actual fighting in the period is rather interesting in terms of the armor, in terms of the guns, in terms of how do you really conduct a late medieval battle. There is a new book by David Grummett. I guess this is a plug for somebody else, but David Grummett is a great historian of the Wars of the Roses, had written a brand new book published by Oxford about sort of the military aspect of the wars. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in that to really grab a copy of that. I may be a political historian first and foremost, but I do like my military stuff as well. And I'm as interested in swords and cannons and archery as anybody else out there who's a medieval aficionado. And I think the Wars of the Roses still has a lot to reveal militarily. And sometimes it's not been very well chronicled that way. So that's definitely an opening for someone who's interested. The political side of things is pretty much understood, though I think there's work and development there too. But the military angle could always use a bit more work.